Hello, Prestige heads, and welcome to Video American Prestige. I'm Danny Bessner, here as always with my friend and comrade Derek Davison, and we are excited to bring you the video. Derek, I will read the question this week. It is from Deadhands, a very spooky name. This question was inspired by our roundtable episode. If I understand Danny's position correctly, the system built around the Imperial Presidency is essentially on autopilot with no meaningful levers that the demos, that is the public, can pull to change course. I don't disagree, but it didn't remind me of how people talked about the late Soviet period. Very broadly, I think people talk about 5 features contributing to the Soviet collapse. First, economic stagnation. Second, failed reforms such as Perestroika and Glasnost. Third, the rise of nationalist movements within the Soviet Union. Fourth, increased competition from its rival, the United States. And fifth, state failure at home, for example, Chernobyl, and abroad, for example, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Dead Hands Spooky continues. I think that America has weak forms of 4 of the 5 features. I don't see any separatist movements, by which Dead Hands means nationalist movements, seriously challenging America at this point. To be clear, I am not saying that I think America is at imminent risk of collapse. I am curious how the American system differs from the late Soviet model. So, Derek, why don't you start this one?
Yeah, so I mean, I would make a couple of comments here. One is I think you're missing another feature that people talked about contributing to the Soviet collapse, at least prior to Gorbachev, which was gerontocracy, which definitely applies here in the United States. But there were these snide reports. You can find them in the old New York Times archives and other places, like kind of lambasting the Soviets because their leadership cadre was in its late 60s or something. It's very quaint. I would recommend you do it. It's a funny thing to read how people were talking about it back then. But there was this sense of like these sclerotic old men. You can still see it in movies. I mean, movies about sort of late Soviet, like Reagan, Danny, which we saw and talked about with the Chapo guys. Like
We should do
you
another
know,
movie
all the
episode,
all the
I was
uh,
thinking.
the like scenes of John Voight and like all these Soviet leaders. They're all depicted as basically the mafia dons in Casino. Like they're all on oxygen, like barely hanging on because they're so old. So that was another thing that people talked about. I think the question though kind of contains the answer in that factor number 4, increased competition from its rival America, simply doesn't exist for the United States and cannot exist for the United States. To steal your thunder here a bit, Danny, because there is no alternative anymore, right? You could point to the United States and capitalism, Western style capitalism, as the alternative to the Soviet system. You could point to it as another way forward. If the Soviet system is stagnating, here's something else that people could grab onto. And if you were somebody like Gorbachev who wanted to maintain the survival of that system and the survival of that country, he certainly did not envision what wound up playing out. But you could try to incorporate elements of Western style capitalism or Western style, quote unquote, democracy into the system gently, gradually, as he thought he was doing, to try to adjust by aping or copying something that was maybe looked like it was functioning a little bit better, or looked like it was working a little bit better. There's no alternative anymore. What is the competing system that if the United States was going to try to change, and I would question even whether we have anything like Glasnost or Perestroika happening in the United States. I think certainly not. I guess you could look at Trumpism as a movement and argue that it's a kind of reform. I mean, reform seems like the wrong word, but a challenge, I guess, to change the system in some way. But it's so reactionary; it doesn't really map onto the things that Gorbachev was trying to do, I don't think. And it's not even clear to me that like anything about this movement is really different from what we already have. It's just a more extreme expression of some of its darker aspects. But yeah, there's no rival. There's no rival. The China is a rival in the sense of being another major economic power that may have designs on regional hegemony in a place where the United States, which believes it should have primacy around the world, doesn't
In
want
a
to be
place where it's been
challenged.
regional hegemon for 5,000 years.
Yeah, of course, obviously. How dare they? but there's no system, like there's no system competition. I guess you could say, state capitalism versus whatever we have now, like crony capitalism, or decrepit late stage uh, capitalism here in the U.S. But even that is such a small distinction. I just don't see what people would adopt that would bring about the downfall of America in the way that the Soviets collapsed around Perestroika and Glasnost. So I feel like, and I mean, the external pressure doesn't exist either, right? I mean, for the Soviets, trying to open up to the West to make economic changes, political changes, gradually, that would adjust their system to be more in line with the rest of the world, it was a huge lift, right? Because all of the institutions that had been designed over the course of the Cold War, basically to function as arms of the U.S. state or the U.S. empire, the IMF, the World Bank, all of these things that kind of create the superstructure for whatever international system exists. It was impossible for the Soviets to really break into that without some kind of huge upheaval, and all of those things still exist. The system's still there the way the United States designed it. Donald Trump may be trying to break it somewhat, but I don't think he's going to be successful. So it's just not an analogous situation to me.
And then the question is, what precisely? Sorry, I was just writing down notes. If you heard the click clack, what precisely would things break off into? Because to some degree, the breakup of the Soviet Union was anti-Russian in character, right? It was anti-Russian hegemony. When you get the breakup of Georgia, the breakup of Ukraine, the breakup of the various Soviet republics, um, there was a thing to break off into these nationalities that had very deep histories of anti-Russianness to some degree, and some of them, though not all of them, that tried to be papered over by the Georgian Stalin and whatnot, but ultimately weren't able to be totally papered over during the course of the Soviet Union's existence. And there's just really nothing like that in this country, because if you think about like there were various institutions within the Soviet republics that could theoretically be amalgamated into a different type of political regime. And Derek, tell me if I'm wrong, but I believe at one point Russia was independent of the Soviet Union, right? At some point, like in the toward the end, there, Yeltsin declares independence, and the
Yeah,
Soviet
Yeltsin.
Union
I mean, there
continues
was
to
a brief
exist.
window
A
where
couple
there was
weeks,
like a
maybe, yeah.
Soviet Union,
December,
and they
yeah.
were trying to figure out
How it could be a
a
Soviet Union
new
without Russia?
way
Yeah,
to constitute those states. But definitely, like, I mean, the Russia declaring independence from the Soviet Union preceded,
the end of the
I
Soviet
think, the
Union.
official end of the Soviet
Yeah,
Union. I mean, it
right.
was was going to happen at that point, like no matter
And,
what. But
and to some
if you want to
degree,
get technical about it, yeah.
yeah, I agree. It's definitely going to happen, but like that could not happen in the United States. To some degree, the history of I wasn't going to do the academic right. I'm not going to foreclose an argument. I will explain it. To some degree, the history of this country is the centralization of power in a national government. Hamilton has triumphed over Jefferson, and that's a institutional accretion of over 2 centuries at this point. And so I think it would be very, you could have, I do think that you're going to see forms of liberal federalism. I've been arguing this for years at this point, that one could imagine if the federal government truly proves so sclerotic that it just does not speak to the interests of um, places where most Americans live in cities and on the coasts, I believe, in terms of concentration of population. So I could imagine like California and Oregon and Washington State being much more federalist about certain things, and kind of the right wing, if they were able to retain power of the national government, which is by no means certainly going to happen. But if that did happen, then you could see a type of liberal federalism. But I don't see a breaking up of the country. I don't see, a founding of the state of Jefferson from whatever mid Oregon into southern Western Canada, basically to Vancouver. So it's difficult to imagine what it would be able to break up into, um, unless you have one faction. And beyond that, regional identity is very weak in this country, and state identity is even weaker, which was not true in the Soviet Union. People still identified as Ukrainians, people still identified as Russians, people still identified as Georgians, and so you also have the identity element just does not exist. People not that many people identify primarily as North Dakotans before Americans. People might have different ideas about what a true American is. Very clearly, they do. But the state and regional identities, I do think, in this age of mass communications and whatnot, has been displaced, or at least the technology of mass communication, mass transportation, et cetera, mass politics, and the experience in war over the course of the 20th century has displaced those types of state and regional identities, even if they do exist in weaker form.
Uh,
So you also
I mean,
have the
yeah,
lack of the
the
identity
Civil
part.
War sort of foreclosed on the idea that you would have national identities wrapped up in regional or state level polities the way that the Soviet Union existed, right? I mean, that was it. Like that was the last sort of gasp for the sort of the idea that you might identify as a Virginian before you identify as an American, like that this was a union of independent states somehow.
Yeah, and I mean, like that that's why Robert E. Lee renames his army the Army of Northern Virginia, right? Like we don't have like the first army of Georgia any longer in the United States, which is reflective of that. And then there's just the sheer question is like the scale of economic collapse. I again, as usual, I think it's very difficult for people who don't live in a moment of like genuine collapse of like things aren't on supermarket stores. People say like go to the local CVS, it's pretty desiccated, but you can still buy all that stuff on Amazon. There was no Amazon in the Soviet Union, so I think that economic collapse could happen, absolutely, but I don't think we're near that yet. It's like when people talk about like the Weimar comparison. It's like it just doesn't complete to the hyperinflation of 1923 Germany, right? And I don't think whatever problems we're having with supply chains here, as of yet, it could change compared to the issues of the late Soviet Union. Like I remember hearing a story, I forget where, but like an army unit was told to go somewhere in like 89 or 90 and they just didn't. Right? Like that was the scale of collapse that was being experienced in the Soviet Union, which I don't think we're here again. Things can happen. I just don't think we're near that yet in this country. Not yet.
Yeah, I agree with you. The structure of that state was such that you had all these different basically nations within it where people could put the notion of sovereignty, or could park their notions of what am I, or identity, that type of thing, that don't exist in the United States. And you had even some of those republics that most of the people in those republics probably didn't want to be in the Soviet Union. I mean, if you look at Estonia, you look at the Baltic states, for example, who were the first to go, the first to declare independence: Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. Um, I think you could make the argument that a majority, or at least nearly a majority, were not terribly thrilled to be in the Soviet Union in the first place. And then, yeah, Danny, to answer your question, actually, I looked this up. The timeline was the Baltic states went, and then Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, I think Moldova as well, sort of declared independence over toward the end of 1991. And then the leaders of the three, the sub national leaders, like the presidents of the republics, of the three kind of core republics, Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, in early December, declared that the Soviet Union was no longer a going concern. So they kind of beat the Soviet government to the punch in terms of dissolving the entity. But yeah, it's just not. I just don't know what. I mean, if the collapse happens, let's say, if the collapse happens in the United States, it won't happen the same way that it happened in the Soviet Union. And in fact, it will probably be a lot more violent, a lot worse, because we don't have those lines that to draw, and those places for everybody to retreat to and say, this is now my country. Instead, you're going to be duking it out over uh, petty ideological cultural things, and that could get a lot worse. So hopefully it won't happen that way.
Yeah, and I think that right now we're in a stage of decline. I don't think we're yet in a stage of collapse. So if that stage comes, I think there needs to be a acceleration of certain things, which again may happen, but I don't think have happened yet, and don't look like they're about to immediately happen, at least in
Right.
my mind. What is
A-
your take on
And
that
to
decline
well,
versus
to
collapse?
I think you're right. I think to come back to a theme we've hit on in maybe every one of these Q&As at this point. I think the part of the reason that people feel crazy is because they feel like they're losing their minds, is because we are in this state of decline, but there's no where to take that. Like there's no place to go with that. There's no, how is this going to end? You know, are we going to have is somebody going to step in and fix everything? Well, how are they going to do that? Because again, there's no alternative on the horizon. There's nothing to look at and say, well, what if we tried things differently and did this? That doesn't exist. It's capitalism, and this uh, presidential fumbling system that we have, and so you're just kind of locked into this glide path of perpetual decline, it seems like, and without any even concept of what we could do differently. And I think that's where a lot of people just get the sense that, which I don't know if it existed for the folks in the Soviet Union, probably after the collapse in the 90s in Russia, certainly when things were just wretched in some of the other republics. We may have skipped over the dissolution and just got into the like perpetual phase of everything's bad and there's no clear path
That's
out
it.
of it.
until
Yeah,
until an exogenous force. Though at least historically, when people say that, something does happen, but unfortunately, sometimes that could be the rise of the Nazi Party, as
yeah.
opposed to any liberatory thing. So I think maybe on that note, Derek, let's call it. Thank you everyone for listening. Please subscribe to YouTube. A bunch of our I don't know, listeners, friends, loved ones have reviewed the show on Apple Podcasts. If you could do that as well, we really appreciate it. It actually does help. Tell your friends about AP, and thank you all for listening. And as always, keep them rocking in the free world. Bye.
Bye.
That's